When a waitress glimpses a forgotten photo inside Big Shaq's wallet, a secret buried for decades shatters her world. A missing mother, a love story lost to time, and a truth too powerful to ignore, all collide in a moment that will leave you breathless. Big Shaq never expected the past to come knocking, but what unfolds next will bring more than just tears. Get ready for a story where every heartbeat changes everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Under the blinding midday sun of Orlando, Shaquille O'Neal eased his massive frame out of a black SUV, the door groaning slightly under the shift of weight. The heat coiled around him like a living thing, thick and sticky, making even the air feel heavy. Sweat beaded on his forehead. But Shaq hardly noticed. His eyes were pinned to the chipped green sign swinging lazily above the door of a forgotten diner. Marlene's Kitchen, a place that looked like it hadn't changed since the night. Something about it called to him, a whisper at the back of his mind he couldn't quite place. Inside, the diner buzzed with the slow hum of ceiling fans and the low murmur of small-town voices. The walls were crowded with old pictures, their colors faded into the same muted palette of age. A jukebox in the corner sputtered out an old country song, its tinny notes barely louder than the creak of the worn booths. Shaq ducked slightly as he stepped through the doorframe, his presence shifting the room's energy in an instant. Heads turned, conversations stalled mid-sentence. Some smiled, recognizing him immediately. Others merely stared, caught between awe and suspicion. Shaq was used to it. Fame was a shadow that trailed him everywhere, sometimes a blessing, often a burden. He walked toward an empty booth near the window, moving with the careful grace of someone well aware of his size. Sliding into the seat, he nodded politely at a middle-aged man, sipping coffee at the counter and a young couple sharing a basket of fries. He didn't crave attention today. He just wanted a meal and a moment away from the endless roar of cameras, contracts, and corporate meetings. A waitress approached, wiping her hands on a faded apron. She looked to be in her early 20s, with unruly brown curls shoved into a loose ponytail, and eyes the color of a stormy ocean, gray-blue, restless, hard to look away from. Her name tag read Brielle, but it was the exhausted kindness in her smile that etched her into Shaq's mind. "Morning," she said, voice bright, but worn thin at the edges. "What can I get you?" Shaq offered a small smile, one that softened the rough lines of his face. "Whatever's good," he rumbled. She scribbled quickly on her pad. "Trust me, nothing here's bad enough to kill you. Pancakes, okay?" "Perfect." As she turned to leave, Shaq felt a strange tug in his chest, a sense of recognition that made no logical sense. He shook it off. Maybe it was just the diner. Places like this had a way of pulling up memories you thought you'd buried. Minutes drifted by. Shaq tapped absently at the laminated menu, his mind wandering. Outside, the heat shimmered on the asphalt like a mirage. Inside, life continued at its own slow rhythm. Forks clinking, a toddler babbling, a cook shouting back orders in a heavy southern drawl. Brielle returned with a plate piled high with pancakes, a mug of steaming coffee balanced expertly on her tray. She set them down with a practiced hand, flashing another small, tired smile. "You visiting?" she asked casually, pouring syrup into a small ceramic cup. "Something like that," Shaq said, reaching for the coffee. "Needed a break from everything." Brielle laughed. A quick, sharp sound. "Don't we all?" The conversation could have ended there, but something rooted Shaq in place, kept his gaze lingering on the waitress longer than politeness usually allowed. There was something about her, something unsettlingly familiar. He chalked it up to coincidence. After all, he'd met thousands of faces over the years. Familiarity was an occupational hazard. Shaq dug into his pancakes, savoring the simplicity of the meal. No overpriced garnishes, no complicated flavors, just butter, syrup, and golden batter. He was halfway through when he reached into his pocket for his wallet, intending to leave a generous tip. That's when it happened. The wallet slipped from his fingers, falling to the floor with a dull thud. Brielle, passing by with a tray of dishes, knelt quickly to retrieve it before he could react. She picked it up, flipping it closed, but not before her eyes snagged on something tucked behind the clear ID window. A photograph. A woman smiling, sunlight kissing her hair into strands of gold, laughter crinkling the corners of her green eyes. She looked young, barely older than Brielle herself. Her dress was simple, summery, the kind you wore to a barbecue or a picnic. It wasn't the style that froze Brielle in place. It was the woman's face, because Brielle knew that face better than her own reflection. Her fingers tightened around the leather wallet, the blood draining from her cheeks so fast she thought she might faint. She fought to keep her breathing steady, to mask the chaos erupting inside her. The diner seemed to shrink, the walls closing in. The dyne of conversation faded to a dull, meaningless hum. Brielle handed the wallet back to Shaq, forcing her features into a neutral mask. Her hands shook, barely perceptibly. Shaq thanked her, oblivious to the war raging in her head, and tucked the wallet back into his pocket. Brielle mumbled something about refilling his coffee and fled to the kitchen, heart hammering so violently she thought everyone could hear it. She shoved through the swinging doors and leaned heavily against the counter, her chest heaving. The photograph. Her mother. The woman who had disappeared from her life when Brielle was only 5 years old. For years Brielle had believed what her grandmother told her, that her mother Selena Carson had been reckless, irresponsible, and had abandoned her to chase some wild, foolish dream. She had grieved, then hardened, building walls around the hollow place where a mother's love should have lived. She hadn't questioned the story. She hadn't dared. But now the truth glared at her from the folds of a stranger's wallet. A man the world revered. A man who carried her mother's picture with the tenderness of a man who had never moved on. Questions exploded inside her, messy and wild. How did Shaquille O'Neal know her mother? Why did he still carry her photo? Why had nobody told her any of this? The world tilted on its axis. And for a long, dangerous moment, Brielle thought about running. About throwing her apron down, shoving open the doors, and vanishing into the unforgiving heat of the Florida afternoon. But she stayed. Because if there was one thing life had taught her, it was that running solved nothing. Brielle took a deep, ragged breath, wiped the sweat from her forehead, and forced herself to walk calmly back into the dining room. Shaq was finishing his coffee, leaning back in the booth, utterly unaware of the storm he had just unleashed. She approached slowly, her mind a battleground of fear and fury, and something dangerously close to hope. Maybe, she thought bitterly, there was a reason her grandmother had been so quick to paint her mother as the villain. Maybe the truth was a whole lot messier than anyone had wanted her to know. Shaq stood and stretched, leaving a crisp $100 bill on the table. He caught Brielle's eye, and smiled, a warm, real smile that made her throat tighten painfully. "Thank you," he said simply. And for a heartbeat, Brielle thought about blurting everything out. Demanding answers. Demanding to know how he fit into the broken, jagged puzzle of her life. But she didn't. Instead, she watched him go, the door swinging closed behind his retreating figure. The moment he disappeared into the heat haze of the parking lot, Brielle sat heavily in the booth he'd just vacated, staring blankly at the empty plate and the half-drunk coffee cup. She pressed her hands flat against the worn tabletop, grounding herself. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. And deep down she knew, whatever secrets had been buried in the dust of her past, they were about to claw their way into the light. Sometimes destiny hides in the smallest accidents, like the slip of a wallet across a greasy diner floor. Shaquille O'Neal hadn't even realized his wallet was slipping, until it smacked the faded linoleum with a sound that snapped Brielle's attention away from her balancing act of coffee cups. Reflexively, she knelt down, her knees brushing the floor as she scooped up the worn leather rectangle. Her fingers curled around it automatically, the ingrained instincts of someone used to cleaning up messes, not of her own making. She intended to hand it back without a second thought. Just another clumsy moment in a day full of clumsy moments. But fate, it seemed, had different plans. The wallet, aged and thick with cards and notes, flopped open slightly in her hand. And just there, half tucked behind a cracked driver's license, and a folded 20, was a photograph. It wasn't new. The edges were frayed, and the colors had started to bleach out from years of handling. But the woman in the picture smiled out at her with a brilliance time couldn't erase. Sunlight lit up her hair in a burnished halo, her arms wrapped around a younger version of herself, laughing, happy, alive. Brielle froze. Her heart stuttered, skipped, and then slammed into overdrive. Because the woman in the photo wasn't just some distant memory. She wasn't a passing resemblance. She was someone Brielle knew better than anyone should know a ghost. It was her mother, Selena Carson, the woman who had been swallowed by the shadows of her childhood, reduced to whispered accusations and hastily buried grief. Brielle's vision narrowed, the diner fading away into a tunnel of rushing blood and confusion. How? Why? Of all the people in the world, why did this stranger, this larger-than-life legend, carry a photo of the mother, who had supposedly abandoned her. Before her shock could betray her, Brielle snapped the wallet closed and rose, forcing her face into an expression of polite neutrality. Her hands trembled, but she willed them still. She couldn't afford to show her scorn to the man sitting across from her, casually reaching out to take back a piece of her stolen past. Shaq smiled warmly as he accepted the wallet, oblivious to the chaos he'd just unleashed. His easy gratitude carved a fresh slice of guilt across Brielle's heart. He didn't know what she'd seen. Didn't know that with one accidental glance, her entire world had tilted off its axis. Brielle mumbled something about checking on the kitchen, and retreated behind the swinging doors, needing space to breathe, to think, to survive the earthquake that had just ripped through her. She leaned heavily against the counter, gripping its edge, until her knuckles whitened. Memories assaulted her, raw and unwelcome. Her grandmother's bitter lectures, the sharp words branding Selena a selfish dreamer, who ran off without a backward glance. The endless nights she lay awake, wondering what she had done wrong to make her mother leave. And now this. A photograph that suggested the story she'd been fed was nothing but half-truths wrapped in fear and resentment. Brielle squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself not to cry. Not here, not now. The answers wouldn't come from falling apart. They never had. Outside, she could hear Shaq's deep voice rumbling a thank you to the cook. The scrape of a chair against the floor. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. Propelled by something deeper than logic, she shoved through the kitchen doors, and caught sight of him just as he dropped a tip onto the table and adjusted his ball cap. He was leaving, and with him might go the only chance she'd ever have at understanding the mother-shaped hole inside her. Her feet moved before her fear could argue otherwise. She reached the door just as Shaq stepped out into the punishing sunlight, the heat bouncing off the cracked pavement in shimmering waves. He paused for a moment, stretching, oblivious to the girl watching him through the glass. Brielle's hand pressed against the cool surface of the door, heart pounding. Questions crowded her throat, desperate for air. Who are you to her? Did she love you? Did you love her? Why didn't you come for me? But the words stayed trapped behind clenched teeth. She wasn't ready. Not yet. The battlefield inside her needed organizing before she could face the giant, who unknowingly held pieces of her broken past. Shaq slid into his SUV and drove away, the powerful engine a low growl against the heavy afternoon. Brielle stood there long after he disappeared, her reflection ghostly in the glass. She turned away finally, each step back into the diner feeling heavier than the last. Her coworkers buzzed around her, oblivious. Plates clattered. The cook barked out another order. The jukebox clicked into another dusty song. To everyone else, it was just another day. But for Brielle, the world had shifted irreversibly. She gathered up the abandoned dishes from Shaq's table, with mechanical precision, every movement deliberate, methodical. She needed a plan. She needed time. She needed time. She needed courage. Brielle wasn't naive. She knew confronting a man like Shaquille O'Neal wouldn't be easy. Fame had a way of fortifying people, building walls higher and thicker than most dared to climb. She couldn't just accuse him in the middle of a diner parking lot. She had to be smart. She had to find proof, build her case piece by painful piece before stepping into the arena. As she scrubbed down the table, her gaze snagged on the $100 bill he'd left under the syrup bottle. Her breath caught at the sight of it. An act of kindness from a man who didn't know he was standing on the fault line of her life. A fault line that had just started to crack wide open. Brielle tucked the bill into the register and wiped her hands on her apron, her mind already spinning faster than she could control. She didn't know what truths she would uncover. She didn't know if they would heal her or hurt her even more. But she knew one thing with blinding certainty. She couldn't turn away now. Destiny had dropped a wallet at her feet and opened a door she hadn't even known existed. She was going to walk through it, no matter what waited on the other side. Some names are written in ink. Others are etched in pain. Night bled into the small town like an old memory, slow and unforgiving. The buzz of crickets filled the heavy Florida air, as Brielle sat cross-legged on the attic floor of her grandmother's creaking house, a single bulb swinging above her, casting long shifting shadows across the boxes stacked around her like forgotten tombstones. Dust floated through the light, dancing in the stillness. She coughed once, wiping the back of her hand across her mouth, but didn't stop digging. The photograph burned a hole in her mind. Selena Carson, smiling from the folds of Shaquille O'Neal's wallet, alive in a moment Brielle had never witnessed. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. She had grown up with faded, bitter stories of a reckless woman who chased dreams instead of motherhood. She had been taught to resent, not to mourn. But tonight, all those lessons crumbled under the weight of a single undeniable truth. There had always been more to the story, and she was going to find it, even if it shattered every lie she'd ever been told. She pried open the first box, its cardboard soft and rotted at the corners. Inside, scraps of another life spilled out. Baby clothes, a frayed quilt, a brittle plastic rattle. She pushed those aside impatiently, reaching deeper. Her hands closed around a heavy stack of yellowed envelopes, tied together with string. They smelled of Madhu and regret. Brielle's hands trembled as she untied the knot, the string snapping in the stale air. One by one she unfolded the letters, scanning the slanted handwriting, her heart pounding louder with every word. Most were addressed to her grandmother, a woman who had built walls so high around her heart that even grief couldn't climb them. The letters spoke of loneliness, of longing, of regret so thick it bled through the paper. Selena had written from different cities: Atlanta, Memphis, New Orleans, names that sounded like foreign countries to the girl who had never left her Florida town. But it wasn't the places that mattered. It was the plea stitched into every line. I miss her every day. Please, Mama, let me come home. She deserves better than this silence. Brielle's throat tightened until she could barely breathe. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. She had been pushed away, exiled by a woman too proud or too afraid to let her back in. That wasn't even the worst part. Tucked near the bottom of the stack was a letter, different from the others. The paper was thicker, the ink darker, the handwriting almost shaky. Brielle unfolded it carefully, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. I met someone, the letter began. His name is Shaquille. He's incredible, kind, funny, makes me feel seen in a way I never have before. But Mama, he's black. And I know you. I know what you'll say. I know the storm this will bring. But I love him. I can't pretend I don't. Brielle read the words over and over, her mind reeling, the pieces slammed into place, jagged and merciless. Her grandmother hadn't just pushed her mother away out of fear for her recklessness. She had pushed her away because of love, the kind of love that didn't fit into the narrow, poisoned mold of prejudice. Selena had fallen in love with a man Brielle's grandmother would never accept. And rather than bend, rather than risk the small-minded whispers of neighbors and church friends, she had slammed the door on her own daughter and never looked back. Brielle's fists clenched the letter so tightly, the paper crumpled. Rage roared through her, hotter than anything she'd ever felt, burning through years of lies and half-truths. How dare they? How dare her grandmother steal the truth, rip away the chance for a different life, a different childhood, a different everything. She pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes, willing the tears to stop, but they came anyway, hot and blinding. She wasn't crying for herself. She was crying for a mother who had fought against silence and been smothered by it anyway. She was crying for a little girl who had been taught to hate a ghost, instead of grieving a mother. When the tears finally subsided, Brielle sat in the attic's suffocating heat, surrounded by the wreckage of her history. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a new, sharper certainty began to bloom. This wasn't just about finding out what had happened. This was about reclaiming it, about unearthing every buried truth, and holding it up to the light, no matter how ugly or painful it might be. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just some celebrity passing through her life. He was a living link to the mother she had been denied, the life she had been stolen from. She wasn't going to let that slip through her fingers. Slowly, Brielle gathered the letters, stacking them neatly. She tucked the crumpled love letter on top, smoothing it as best she could. She had proof now, not just a photograph glimpsed by accident, but the written words of a mother who had loved fiercely and been betrayed cruelly. Brielle rose, her legs stiff, her muscles sore. She carried the box downstairs, moving carefully, reverently, as though she was transporting something sacred. In the kitchen, the old clock on the wall ticked loudly into the stillness. Midnight had long since passed. Tomorrow, the world would wake up and carry on with its comfortable lies. But Brielle wouldn't. She placed the box gently on the kitchen table, her mind already spinning with plans. She would find Shaq again. She would confront him, not with anger but with the desperate hunger for the truth that had been starved in her for too long. He owed her answers. Maybe he owed her even more than that. Outside, the night deepened, thick and impenetrable. But inside Brielle, a flame had been lit. A fierce, unstoppable hunger for the past, for justice, for her mother's stolen dignity. Some names were written in ink, some were etched in pain, and Brielle Carson had finally found hers. Even giants have ghosts, and sometimes they live right under their ribs. The drive home was a blur, the familiar streets of Orlando folding into each other like half-forgotten dreams. Shaquille O'Neal gripped the steering wheel tightly, his massive hands oddly tentative, like a man trying to steady himself against a storm only he could feel. The diner had seemed so harmless, a stop on a random, unplanned day, but something inside him shifted the moment he stepped out into the smothering heat, a sensation he couldn't shake, like an old wound reopening without warning. At home, Shaq kicked off his sneakers and made his way to the living room, a cavernous space filled with trophies, plaques and memories, stacked like monuments to a life most people would envy. The accolades glinted under the soft recessed lights, but tonight, they felt hollow. Achievements couldn't silence the echoes of what he had lost. He sank heavily onto the leather couch, the frame creaking under his weight. For a long moment, he sat there, motionless, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant chirp of crickets outside. Then, almost without thinking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. The leather was worn smooth from years of use, the edges frayed. He flipped it open slowly, his fingers brushing over the photo tucked behind his license. The picture was creased, the colors fading, but the woman in it still smiled with the same reckless joy that had once shattered his carefully constructed world. Selena Carson. The name alone was enough to summon a flood of memories he had tried so hard to dam. He remembered the first time he saw her, all sunshine and sharp laughter, unapologetically alive. She had been unlike anyone he had ever met. Bold, fearless, refusing to be diminished by the small-minded expectations of the town they both had quietly despised. They had met in secret at first, knowing the world wouldn't understand, wouldn't approve. In a town suffocated by unspoken rules and inherited prejudices, their love had been an act of rebellion. It had been thrilling, electric, but also dangerous. Shaq leaned back against the couch, closing his eyes. He could still hear the arguments, the whispered warnings from his friends, the tense conversations with family, the ugly words spat from passing strangers when they dared to walk down Main Street together. He had tried to ignore it, tried to be stronger than the tide pulling them apart, but youth and fear made a coward out of even the strongest men, and Shaq had been no different. When Selena told him she was pregnant, he had frozen, not from lack of love, but from the crushing weight of what that life would mean for her, for him, for a child born into a world that already hated them before they took their first breath. He had convinced himself he was protecting them by stepping back, by giving her a chance at a better life without the target his name and fame would inevitably paint on their backs. He told himself it was mercy, it was wisdom, it was a lie. He hadn't protected her, he had abandoned her. Selena hadn't fought him. She had simply looked at him with an ache, so deep, it hollowed him out. She had walked away, carrying his heart with her, and he had let her go because it was easier to pretend it was for the best than to face his own fear. And now, all these years later, here he was, rich beyond measure, famous beyond imagining, and yet utterly powerless against the ache of a single photograph. Shaq rubbed a hand over his face, the calloused palm rasping against his beard. Guilt gnawed at him, relentless and sharp. He had spent years trying to track Selena down, trying to find the right words, the right time to make amends. But every lead turned cold, every letter unanswered, and somewhere along the way, he convinced himself that maybe she didn't want to be found. He wondered if she was still alive, wondered if she hated him, wondered if she ever told their child, their daughter, about him. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. A daughter, flesh of his flesh, walking the world without knowing him, without knowing that he had loved her before she even drew her first breath, without knowing that he had failed her before she even had a chance to know his name. He sat there staring at the photo, the weight of regret heavier than any championship ring he had ever worn. Shaq thought about the waitress at the diner, the one with the storm-gray eyes and the guarded smile. There had been something about her, something that gnawed at him the longer he sat there. A pull he couldn't explain. He pushed the thought aside, unwilling to chase ghosts tonight. It was just the memories playing tricks on him. That's what he told himself. But deep down, a part of him, a quiet, desperate part, wondered if fate had just offered him a second chance, or maybe it was just one more reminder of what he had lost. The night stretched endlessly before him, heavy with silence. Shaq remained on the couch, the photograph clutched loosely in his hand. As the minutes dragged into hours, outside the world kept turning, indifferent to the ghosts, shackled to his heart. Tomorrow would come, and with it the endless noise of life. Contracts to sign, appearances to make, cameras to smile for. But tonight, he allowed himself the luxury of mourning. Mourning a love he had thrown away. Mourning a daughter he might never know. Mourning the man he might have been if he hadn't let fear make his choices for him. Shaq closed his eyes again, the photo resting against his chest like a confession. He whispered a prayer into the darkness. Not for forgiveness. He knew he didn't deserve it. But for a chance, however slim, to set things right. Even giants had ghosts. And Shaquille O'Neal was haunted by the biggest one of all. The past doesn't knock. It breaks in when you least expect it. The sun was already high when Brielle tied her apron around her waist and stepped into Marlene's kitchen, the diner buzzing with the lazy chatter of regulars and the clatter of dishes. She moved on autopilot, pouring coffee, clearing tables, delivering plates heavy with pancakes and hope. But underneath the motions, her heart beat a frantic, uneven rhythm. She knew he would come back. Somehow, she just knew. And he did. Shaquille O'Neal's figure filled the doorway a little after 11, the midday heat haloing him in a golden blur. He wore the same easy smile, the same casual clothes that somehow couldn't hide the weight he carried inside. He looked around, caught her eye, and offered a nod. Brielle forced a smile, her stomach flipping. Today was the day she would ask. Today was the day she would step into the storm. She approached his booth, pen and notepad in hand, as if it were any other day, any other customer. Shaq ordered coffee and biscuits, thanking her with that rumbling voice that made the walls seem smaller. As she poured his coffee, her hand hesitated just a fraction too long, the liquid swirling darkly in the cup. "You always keep a photo in your wallet?" she asked lightly, a feigned casualness in her tone. Shaq's brow furrowed slightly, then relaxed into a wistful grin. He leaned back against the booth, his enormous hands cradling the steaming mug. The question didn't seem to alarm him, not yet. "Yeah," he said, his voice softer than she expected. "Some memories you can't afford to lose." Brielle swallowed hard, masking the tremor in her hands by wiping the counter. She must have been important. There was a beat of silence. Shaq stared into his coffee like it held the answers he couldn't find. Then he spoke, the words slow, weighed down by something heavier than regret. "Her name was Selena," he said almost reverently. "She was different, wild in the best way. She didn't care what anyone thought. She made you feel like you were the only person in the world that mattered." Brielle clutched her notepad tighter, her knuckles whitening. Shaq's gaze grew distant, lost in the folds of memory. "We met when everything was complicated. Different worlds, you know. People looking at us like we didn't belong together. Whispering, staring. It got to her more than she let on. But she never showed it. Not to me." He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "I thought I was protecting her by staying away. Told myself she'd be better off without me. But," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Some mistakes you don't realize you've made until they're carved into your bones." Brielle's chest ached at the raw honesty in his voice. She wanted to scream, to shake him, to tell him that mistake had cost her everything. But she held her tongue, forcing herself to stay anchored in the moment. "What happened to her?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Shaq shrugged, the gesture heavy, defeated. "I don't know," he admitted. "I tried to find her. Years later, hired people, searched records. Nothing. It's like she vanished." Brielle felt the weight of those words crash over her. Her mother hadn't just disappeared because she was careless or selfish. She had been erased, hidden by circumstances that neither love nor fame could conquer. "Do you think she wanted to be found?" she asked, her voice careful. Shaq looked at her then, really looked, and for a heartbeat, Brielle wondered if he saw it. The resemblance, the way her mother's spirit lived on in the stubborn set of her jaw, the glint in her storm-gray eyes. But he only smiled, sadly. "I want to believe she did." Brielle nodded stiffly, retreating before her mask cracked wide open. She scribbled something meaningless on her notepad and fled back behind the counter, her mind a tangled, burning mess. He didn't know. He had no idea. And she wasn't ready to tell him. Not yet. Instead, she watched him from the corner of her eye, as he ate, as he joked quietly with a family at the next booth, as he left another absurdly generous tip under his coffee cup. She watched the way he carried himself, not like a man who thought he was better than anyone else, but like someone who had been broken once and still hadn't quite forgiven himself for surviving. As he left, their eyes met again, and this time, Brielle thought she saw a flicker of something, a recognition that hadn't been there before. But then he was gone, the door swinging closed behind him, leaving only the smell of coffee and the heavy thud of her heart. The day dragged on, the minutes slow and syrupy. Customers came and went, faces blurring together. But Brielle couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between her and the giant who carried her mother's ghost in his pocket. She leaned against the counter as the diner emptied out near closing time, the sky outside bruised purple and gold. Her fingers brushed the edge of the register absent-mindedly, her mind spinning. Shaq's words replayed in her head, over and over, each one cutting deeper. Selena. Wild. Brave. Lost. She wondered if her mother had ever known how much she was loved. If she had ever realized that her memory lived on in a heart bigger than any stadium. Shaq had ever filled. Brielle squeezed her eyes shut, pushing the thoughts away. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The truth was bleeding out, slow and relentless, and soon it would flood every corner of the life Brielle had thought she understood. And when it did, no one would be the same again. Old letters never forget, even when people do. The attic groaned under the weight of memories, as Brielle climbed back up into its dusty darkness, the beam of her flashlight slicing through the thick, unmoving air. She hadn't meant to return so soon after her last discovery, but the conversation with Shaq left her restless, raw, and desperate for more. The truth had cracked open, but it wasn't enough. She needed the whole story, no matter how much it hurt. Kneeling beside the stack of boxes she'd torn through days ago, she dug deeper. Old photo albums, crumbling recipe books, boxes of faded Christmas ornaments, all relics of a life built on carefully curated lies. Then, near the bottom of one battered trunk, her fingers caught on a corner of something wedged between the slats. A thin envelope, brittle with time, slipped free into her hand. Her heart lurched at the name scrawled across the front, in hurried, looping script. Selena. No address, no stamp, just her mother's name. Brielle's breath caught in her throat as she eased the flap open and pulled out the folded paper inside. The ink was faded but still legible, the words sprawling across the page with a desperate kind of energy that made her chest tight. Dear Mama, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe you'll find it one day, tucked somewhere you least expect. Maybe by then it won't matter. But tonight, I have to write it anyway, because my heart's too heavy to carry this alone. I met someone. His name's Big S. You'll roll your eyes at that, I know. You'll say he's trouble, say he's not our kind of people. But you'd be wrong, Mama. He's more than anyone's expectations. He's kind, patient, makes me laugh when I'm drowning, makes me feel like I'm more than just a pretty face wasting away in a town that never really saw me. Brielle's hands trembled, the words blurring as tears filled her eyes. She wiped them away roughly, forcing herself to keep reading. We talked about a future once. A little house somewhere nobody knew our names. Kids with big smiles and bigger dreams. It was stupid, maybe, naive. But for a little while it felt real. It felt possible. Then the world reminded us of what we were, of what people would never let us be. I thought love would be enough to fight it. God help me. I believed that. But fear's a poison, Mama. It gets in your blood. It steals your breath. And Big S, he got scared. I don't blame him. Not really. How can you blame a man for being broken by a world that never wanted him whole? The letter quivered in Brielle's hands. The edges cut into her palms, grounding her against the tidal wave of emotion rising inside her. So he let go. And I let him. Because what choice did we have? Stay and watch the world tear us apart inch by bloody inch? Or walk away, holding on to the pieces we could still call ours? I'm not angry at him. I'm angry at the world that made him believe he had to choose. I'm angry at the fear that lives in people's bones, handed down like some cursed heirloom. I'm angry at you too, Mama, because I know you'd rather I forget him, erase him, pretend he was just a mistake to outgrow. But I can't. I won't. He's a part of me now. A part of whatever future I still have left. Even if you slam the door in my face. Even if you never forgive me, I have to live my truth. Even if it costs me everything. I hope one day you understand. I hope one day you forgive me for loving him. Selena. Brielle folded the letter with shaking fingers, pressing it to her chest as she closed her eyes against the weight of her mother's pain. It wasn't just a love story. It was a battleground, a war fought against ignorance, fear, and the crushing weight of expectation. A war they had lost not because they didn't love enough, but because the world refused to love them back. She sat there for a long time, the letter clutched tightly, the attic silent except for the soft drip of water from a leak in the roof. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head, stern and cold. She made her choices, Brielle. She lived with the consequences. But now Brielle knew the truth. Selena hadn't run from her responsibilities. She hadn't abandoned her daughter because she was selfish. She had been exiled, locked out of her own life by prejudice disguised as protection. Brielle wiped her face and stood, a new resolve hardening in her spine. She tucked the letter into her jacket pocket, close to her heart where it belonged. No more half-truths. No more polite lies. It was time to bring the shadows into the light. She made her way downstairs, the old wood groaning under her feet. In the kitchen, the clock ticked loudly, marking time as if daring her to waste another second. Brielle didn't hesitate. She grabbed her keys from the counter, pocketed her phone, and headed out into the humid Florida night. The air clung to her skin, thick and oppressive, but she welcomed it. It felt honest in a way the house never had. She didn't have a plan, not exactly. She just knew she had to find him. She had to show him the letter, had to tell him that Selena hadn't stopped loving him. That even when the world tore them apart, she had carried him with her, stitched into the fabric of her soul. Brielle drove with the windows down, the warm night air rushing past her, carrying away the last remnants of the girl who had once believed every lie she was told. She wasn't that girl anymore. The door her grandmother had slammed shut years ago was creaking open, and Brielle was walking through it, fearless, furious, and determined to reclaim what was stolen. The truth wasn't neat. It wasn't safe, but it was hers now, and she would not let it be buried again. Truth isn't always a revelation. Sometimes, it's a wrecking ball. The next morning was sticky with heat, even before the sun fully rose, the sky a pale bruise of gold and gray. Brielle stood outside Marlene's kitchen, the worn envelope tucked securely inside her jacket, her fingers twitching with nerves she couldn't shake. Every time the door creaked open, her heart surged, then crashed when it was just another familiar face oblivious to the private war raging inside her. She didn't know how she would say the words once he arrived. She only knew she couldn't keep them trapped any longer. The letter, the photograph, the aching absence that stretched between them. It was all rising to a boiling point. She wasn't here to accuse or destroy. She was here for the truth, for the girl she used to be. For the mother who deserved more than silence. The rumble of Shaq's SUV pulling into the parking lot jolted her into motion. She wiped her sweaty palms on her jeans and forced herself to breathe. The door opened, the familiar ding of the bell slicing the heavy air, and Shaq stepped out, ducking under the frame with the careful grace of a man used to shrinking himself for smaller spaces. Their eyes met across the lot. For a split second, the world held its breath. Brielle moved first, her boots scuffing the asphalt as she cut across the parking lot toward him. Shaq's easy smile faltered when he saw her coming, something wary flickering across his face. He slowed his step, sensing the gravity in her stride, the way she carried herself like a storm barely contained. She stopped a few feet from him, chest heaving slightly, every muscle coiled tight. The diner buzzed behind her, life going on as if two worlds weren't about to collide, in a collision neither could escape. "I need to ask you something," Brielle said, her voice low, urgent. Shaq nodded cautiously, shoving his hands into his pockets. "All right." She pulled the letter from her jacket, with trembling fingers, and held it out. Shaq hesitated before taking it, his big hands dwarfing the fragile paper. His eyes skimmed the first few lines, and Brielle watched the color drain from his face as recognition sank in. He looked up at her, confusion swirling in his dark eyes. "Where did you get this?" Brielle swallowed hard. "It was my mother's." Shaq's brow furrowed deeper. His gaze snapped back to the letter, then to her again, searching her face as if trying to piece together a puzzle whose edges had been worn smooth by time. "My mother's name," Brielle said, forcing the words past the lump in her throat, "was Selena Carson." The silence between them cracked open, raw and bottomless. Shaq's mouth opened, closed. He stumbled a step back, the letter fluttering between his fingers like a white flag. His lips moved soundlessly for a moment, before he managed to rasp, "Selena." Brielle nodded once, the motion sharp, painful. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the exact moment the truth detonated behind his eyes. saw how it staggered him, gutted him, saw how the memories came rushing back to him all at once, smashing into the present like a wrecking ball, just as unstoppable and just as merciless. He started, then trailed off, voice breaking. My daughter, Brielle finished for him, her voice trembling but steady. Shaq staggered back another step, his breath hitching like he'd taken a hit straight to the heart. He dragged a hand down his face, as if trying to wipe away the impossible truth, but it clung to him, undeniable. You can't, he whispered, then shook his head violently. No, I didn't know. I never knew. Brielle's throat burned, her nails biting crescents into her palms. She had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, with fury, with tears, with accusations. But standing here now, all she felt was the aching, gaping void, left behind by too many stolen years. My grandmother, she said, her voice cracking, she told me my mom left me, that she didn't want me. But that's not what happened. She loved you. She loved me. She was trying to come back, but she shook her head, unable to finish. Shaq crumpled onto the edge of the sidewalk, sitting heavily like the air had been sucked from his lungs. The letter slipped from his hands, fluttering to the concrete. He buried his face in his hands, broad shoulders shaking. Brielle stood frozen, torn between the urge to comfort him and the jagged need to protect what little of herself hadn't already been laid bare. After a long, shuddering moment, Shaq lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot, shining with tears he didn't try to hide. I failed her, he said hoarsely. I failed both of you. Brielle didn't argue. She didn't need to. The truth was there between them, too heavy to deny. Shaq rubbed his face again, like a man trying to wake from a nightmare he'd built for himself. I thought walking away would protect her. Protect you. I thought I was doing the right thing. But I was just scared. I let fear make me a coward. Brielle knelt down, picking up the letter gently, brushing the dust from its creased surface. She tucked it back into her jacket without looking at him. I'm not here to blame you, she said, her voice soft but steely. I just needed to know. I needed to understand. Shaq nodded slowly, misery etched into every line of his face. I want to fix this, he said. I don't know how, but I have to try. Brielle stared at him for a long beat, weighing his words. In his eyes, she saw a man stripped bare, no fame, no money, no armor. Just a father, broken, and desperate for a second chance he didn't deserve, but was begging for anyway. Finally, she nodded once. We'll figure it out, she said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was something. As they stood there in the sweltering Florida heat, the diner's neon sign buzzing above them, two fractured lives began, slowly and painfully, to stitch themselves back together. It's not fists or weapons that wound deepest. It's silence, shame, and the chains nobody sees. The late afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows across the diner's cracked parking lot, as Shaq sat heavily on the curb, elbows resting on his knees, head bowed low. Beside him, Brielle hovered awkwardly, the silence between them stretching taut and brittle. The distant whir of traffic filled the gaps where words should have lived, but neither rushed to fill the void. Some truths demanded space to breathe. Shaq finally lifted his head, his dark eyes glassy but steady. He seemed smaller somehow, stripped of the larger-than-life aura the world had wrapped him in. Here, now, he wasn't Big Shaq, the unstoppable force of courts and cameras. He was just a man who had broken things he could never fully mend. I was a kid when I met your mom, he began, voice low and heavy. Fresh into the league, thought I was invincible. Money, fame, power, it all came too fast. And she was like this anchor. This reminder that I wasn't just headlines and highlights. Brielle stayed silent, watching him, letting him unravel the knots he'd tied around himself. We fell fast, Shaq continued, but the world around us didn't fall with us. Everywhere we went, it was like carrying a target on our backs. Stares, whispers, sometimes worse. People made it clear, a black man and a white woman, that kind of love didn't have a place. Not in that town, not in that time. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. We tried to pretend it didn't matter, that we were strong enough to drown out the noise. But it wore us down. Little by little, it chipped away at the edges. Brielle shifted her weight, gravel crunching beneath her boots. She thought of the stories her grandmother had whispered. Poisonous little seeds planted carefully, nurtured with silence and shame. The love her mother had fought for was never given a chance to bloom. Shaq rubbed his palms together, as if trying to scrub away years of regret. When she told me she was pregnant, I panicked. I thought about what it would mean for you, for her, for a kid caught between two worlds that didn't want them together. I told myself it would be easier for her if I walked away, that if I wasn't there, maybe the world would leave her alone. Brielle felt the words strike her like stones. She had lived a whole life believing she was abandoned because she wasn't wanted. But now, hearing the truth, it almost hurt more. To know it wasn't a lack of love, it was too much fear. You didn't even try, she said quietly, the first crack in her voice revealing the splintering inside. Shaq's head dropped, shame radiating from him. No, I didn't. I didn't fight for her. I didn't fight for you. I let fear decide who I was gonna be. And I've lived every day since regretting it. The raw honesty in his voice left no room for anger, only sorrow. Brielle crossed her arms over her chest, the letter weighing heavy in her pocket. She thought about all the birthdays spent wondering, about the school plays where she scanned the crowd for a face she would never recognize, about the nights she cried into a pillow pretending she didn't care. She waited for you, Brielle said, her voice low. Even after you left, she wrote letters, begged to come home, begged to bring me with her. But my grandmother, she wouldn't let her. Shaq closed his eyes, pain etched deep into the lines of his face. She told me my mom left me because she didn't want me. Brielle continued, the words tumbling out faster now, fueled by years of buried hurt. She made me believe I wasn't worth fighting for. Shaq's fists clenched around his knees, his knuckles whitening. You were worth everything, he said fiercely. You still are. For a long moment, neither spoke. The past hung around them, thick and suffocating. A chain neither could break alone. Finally, Shaq shifted, turning to face her fully. His voice was rough, but steady. I can't change what I did. I can't give you back the years we lost. But if you'll let me, I want to be here now. I want to know you. Not because I have some right to, but because I need to, because you deserve at least that much. Brielle stared at him, heart thudding painfully. Part of her wanted to run, to shield herself from the vulnerability clawing its way to the surface. But another part, the part shaped by longing, by years of unanswered questions, reached for the possibility of something more. I don't know if I can just forgive and forget, she said honestly. Shaq nodded solemnly. I'm not asking you to. He stood slowly, towering over her, but his presence wasn't imposing. It was careful, gentle. I'll earn it, he said. If you'll let me. Brielle looked up at him, at the man who carried the weight of invisible chains, chains made of fear, of shame, of mistakes too heavy to carry alone. She thought of her mother, of the battles Selena had fought and lost, and how much courage it took just to love in a world determined to tear that love apart. She thought of herself standing at the crossroads between bitterness and possibility. Slowly, she nodded. We'll see, she said. Shaq's lips twitched into the barest hint of a smile. Not hope. Not yet. But something close. The chains weren't gone. They might never be. But for the first time, they felt lighter. Carried together instead of alone. As the sun dipped low behind the diner, and the shadows lengthened across the asphalt, Brielle and Shaq stood side by side, two broken hearts learning, maybe for the first time, that healing doesn't always come from forgetting. Sometimes it comes from finally speaking the truth out loud. Healing isn't a lightning bolt. It's a slow sunrise over wreckage. The diner was almost empty by the time Brielle returned inside, her heart still thundering in her chest. Shaq followed a step behind, his massive presence somehow feeling careful, deliberate, as though afraid that one wrong move might shatter the fragile thread between them. The walls of Marlene's kitchen, once just background noise to her life, now seemed to hold their breath, listening in. Brielle grabbed 2 coffees without asking, setting them down at a corner booth far from the windows, tucked away like a secret. Shaq slid into the seat across from her, his hands too big for the delicate porcelain cup he lifted with a slow, almost reverent motion. Neither spoke for a long moment. Brielle stared at her coffee, watching the steam rise and curl, wishing it could carry away the mess in her chest. 1,000 questions pressed against her lips, but none made it past the barricade she had built over the years. How do you rebuild a bridge from ruins? How do you even begin? Shaq set his cup down carefully and cleared his throat. The sound was rough, uneven, stripped of the booming confidence the world expected of him. I'm not here to pretend, he said, voice low. I know I missed everything. First steps, first words, first heartbreaks. I can't even imagine all the things I should have been there for. Brielle tightened her grip on the mug, feeling the ceramic dig into her palms. I don't want to erase what happened, he continued. I don't deserve to. But if there's a way, if there's even the smallest chance, I want to be part of your life now, not because I want to make myself feel better, but because you deserve to be known, to be loved, fully. The words hung there, raw and trembling between them. Brielle lifted her eyes slowly, meeting his. There was no performance there, no manufactured emotion, just a man stripped bare, offering what little he had left, knowing it might not be enough. You think a few conversations will fix years? She asked, the bitterness sharper than she intended. Shaq didn't flinch. No, he said simply. It might not fix anything. It might just be a start. She wanted to stay angry. Anger was clean. Anger was easier. But it slipped through her fingers now, replaced by something messier, sorrow, longing, the terrifying thrum of hope she didn't know if she could trust. I don't know if I can trust you, she admitted, her voice cracking. Shaq nodded, accepting the blow. I'll earn it, he said again. A quiet promise. Brielle stared down at the scratched table between them, tracing invisible lines with her fingertip. Part of her still screamed to protect herself, to slam the door before it could hurt anymore. But another part, smaller, quieter, leaned toward the warmth in his voice, the honesty in his eyes. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about pretending the past hadn't left scars. It was about learning to live with them, to find beauty in the brokenness. I'm not ready, she said after a long silence. Shaq smiled sadly. That's okay. I'll wait. Outside, the sky had darkened to a rich indigo, the first stars flickering uncertainly into existence. The diner lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a gentle glow around them like a shield against the darkness beyond the windows. Brielle let out a long breath she didn't realize she was holding. If we do this, she said carefully, it has to be slow, no big gestures, no acting like everything's fine. Shaq's eyes gleamed with something close to gratitude. Whatever pace you need. I'm not here to rush you. She watched him for another beat, studying the lines of his face, the way his shoulders slumped slightly under the weight he carried. Not the weight of fame or expectations, the heavier weight of regret. One thing at a time, she said. He nodded. One thing at a time. They sat in silence for a while longer, sipping coffee gone lukewarm. It wasn't comfortable silence. Not yet. But it wasn't empty, either. It was the kind of silence that hinted at something being rebuilt, carefully, painfully, but rebuilt all the same. Finally, Brielle slid out of the booth, standing slowly. She hesitated, then reached into her jacket and pulled out the letter, Selena's letter, and set it gently on the table in front of him. Shaq looked down at it, his hands shaking slightly as he touched the edges. That's yours, Brielle said, her throat tight. You should have it. He blinked rapidly, fighting emotion, then nodded. Thank you. Brielle shoved her hands into her pockets, rocking back on her heels. I work double shifts the next few days, she said awkwardly. But maybe after, we could, I don't know, talk. Shaq's smile was small but real. I'd like that. She turned and started toward the door, every step feeling like walking on new, fragile ground. Before she pushed through into the night, she looked back once. He was still sitting there, clutching the letter like it was the most precious thing he had ever been given. And maybe, she thought, it was. Outside, the air was cooler, a soft breeze chasing away the heavy heat of the day. Brielle tilted her face to the stars, letting the night wash over her. The past wasn't gone. The hurt wasn't healed. But for the first time, the door wasn't slammed shut. It stood cracked open, just enough to let a sliver of hope through. She wasn't sure where this road would lead. She wasn't sure if forgiveness was even possible. But for the first time in a long time, she wanted to find out. One step. One conversation. One fragile sunrise at a time. Sometimes the family you lose finds you when you least expect it. The afternoon sun dipped low behind the sprawling oak trees, casting long fingers of golden light across the front porch of a modest house, nestled deep in the quiet side of Orlando. It wasn't the kind of place paparazzi bothered with. No flashing cameras or screaming headlines. Just a well-worn path leading up to a screen door that creaked when Brielle pushed it open. Shaq stood just inside, his frame somehow shrinking in the presence of the small, tidy living room filled with old photographs, knitted blankets, and the faint smell of something sweet baking in the kitchen. He glanced back at her, offering a reassuring nod, then called gently into the house. "Meh. Someone's here I want you to meet." Footsteps approached, slow but steady. Brielle wiped her sweaty palms on her jeans, her heart thudding hard against her ribs. She didn't know what she expected. Rejection, maybe, suspicion, the kinds of cold walls she had spent her whole life climbing and falling from. Instead, a woman appeared in the doorway, her hair silvered with age but her back straight, her eyes sharp and kind. Lucille O'Neal. She was smaller than Brielle imagined, but there was a strength in her posture, a warmth in the smile that slowly stretched across her face as she looked first at Shaq, then at Brielle. "This her?" Lucille asked, voice rich and deep. Shaq nodded, emotion flickering across his features. "This is Brielle." Lucille stepped forward without hesitation, taking Brielle's hand between both of hers. Her grip was firm but gentle, grounded. "I'm Lucille," she said, her voice steady, "and I'm real glad you're here." The simple words cracked something inside Brielle, something she hadn't even known was still standing. She swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in her eyes. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucille smiled wider, then motioned toward the living room. "Come on in, baby. Let's get to know each other." They sat together on a worn couch that sagged comfortably in the middle, Lucille settling into her armchair with a cup of tea balanced on one knee. Shaq lowered himself into a chair across from them, his gaze soft, almost fragile. Brielle perched on the edge of the couch, feeling the letter still tucked in her pocket, the invisible tether that had pulled her into this moment. Lucille didn't pepper her with questions. She didn't demand explanations. Instead, she shared stories about Shaq's childhood, about the scrapes he got into, about the triumphs he never boasted about, and the mistakes he never hid. She spoke of family not as something perfect, but as something chosen, repaired, rebuilt. "You don't have to be born into a family to belong to it," Lucille said, her voice gentle but sure. "Sometimes, it's the ones you find along the way who make all the difference." Brielle listened, the tight knot in her chest loosening a little more with each passing minute. For the first time in a long time, she felt herself stepping out from under the heavy shadow of loneliness. After a while, Lucille rose and disappeared into the back of the house, leaving Shaq and Brielle alone in the fading light. Shaq leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "She's been waiting a long time for a granddaughter to spoil," he said with a half smile. "You might want to run while you still can." Brielle laughed, a soft, shaky sound that surprised even her. It wasn't forced. It wasn't hollow. It was real. I think I'll stick around," she said. Shaq's smile deepened, but there was still a question lingering in his eyes, an uncertainty he didn't dare voice. Brielle reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph she had found days ago, the one that started it all. She held it out to him. "I think she'd want us to try," she said. Shaq took the photo carefully, his fingers trembling slightly as he looked at it, at Selena's bright smile, frozen forever in a moment before the world broke them apart. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Lucille returned a few minutes later, with a battered photo album in her hands. She sat beside Brielle, flipping it open to a page filled with faded pictures of birthday parties, graduations, awkward teenage smiles. "We'll make some new pages," she said simply. And for the first time, Brielle believed it was possible. They spent the evening talking, laughing, sharing pieces of themselves that had been buried too long. Shaq told her about the first time he dunked a basketball and shattered the hoop, and about how he got grounded afterward, superstar or not. Lucille shared stories about family cookouts, about bad haircuts, and worse fashion choices. Brielle listened, asked questions, and slowly, cautiously, shared bits of her own life too. About the lonely Christmas mornings, about the dreams she'd had to pack away, about the walls she had built just to survive. They didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. They didn't gloss over the pain, but they didn't let it define them either. By the time Brielle stood on the porch again, the stars were scattered thick across the velvet sky, and the air was cool and full of possibility. Shaq stood beside her, hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking up at the stars. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think forgiveness was about saying everything was okay, pretending none of it hurt." Brielle glanced at him, waiting. "But it's not," he said. "It's about choosing to build something even when the ground's still broken." She nodded slowly, the weight of the past still there, but no longer unbearable. We'll build it, she said. Slow, but real. Shaq smiled. That big, warm, unmistakable smile that she realized she had seen 1,000 times on highlight reels. But never like this. Never aimed at her. They stood together for a long while, two broken halves finally finding the courage to start making a whole. And in the distance, just beyond the porch light's reach, the first tender notes of healing began to hum through the night air. Not loud, not perfect, but real. If this story moved something inside you, imagine the thousands more waiting just beyond the next page.
Every secret, every heartbreak, every redemption is just getting started.
Stay with us, where forgotten truths find their voice, and broken hearts finally find their way home. Because the most powerful stories, they're the ones we live together.